Hello, my name's Tristram Hooley and I'm giving a lecture for the University of Derby looking at writing and particularly trying to help students think about how, why, when and what they should be writing. So let's start with a nice quote from Ernest Hemingway. He says, "There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." And this sense of writing as a painful process that extracts our kind of very soul from us is probably something that we're familiar with. But I think one of the things that we need to remember is writing is actually a skill. It's something that we can get better at. We need to think about what we want to say, of course, but the process of putting that into writing is something that every time we do some writing, we actually improve. Now, I'm going to offer you some tips today, but none of those tips will really replace the fact of actually getting writing, trying writing, and improving the way you do it through practice. So this is what I'm going to cover, and let's start with the question of why we write at all. So this really nice quote from Tony Watts, which he gave at his final lecture at the University of Derby. He said, "My main reason for writing is simple. I do not know what I think until I've written it. In conversation, one can get away with loose, exploratory thinking, but in writing it down, one has to weigh up the arguments and the evidence and decide what it all means and where one stands. It's hard work, but important, and if published, it adds to the body of knowledge on which others can draw. I commend it to you as a professional practice." So Watts' argument is that writing is actually the process of thinking, of working out what we really believe, of what we're really trying to say. And if you feel that that's really difficult and you experience writer's block and that you find it really difficult to put things down on paper, then a really good exercise to do just to get you started is what's called free writing. So if you set a clock for perhaps 2 minutes, you get your pencil or your pen and you sit down and you write and you keep writing regardless of whatever it is you're thinking or saying. So just write, just start to write. If you can't think of anything, say I can't think of anything, write that down. If you're looking around the room, say I can see the wall's painted white, and so on. And what you'll see is that you can write. Writing is not difficult. It's deciding what to say. But what you'll often find when you do these kind of free writing exercises is that you will start to generate material that is useful to you and that you can then go back and edit. And we're going to come on to that later on. So writing's important. It helps us to think. It's not always something we can do straight away, and it might require some editing. So why do we get you to write at all? Well, we've got lots of learning outcomes for the course here. And if we look, we can see that none of them really include writing. None of them actually say anything about writing. So what we're using is writing as a way to test your understanding of some of these other areas of skills and knowledge. And that's a kind of an interesting thing, and it's something that there's debate about. But writing's powerful as a form of assessment, both because it forces you, as we heard from Tony Watts, to think carefully, to put down what you think in detail, but also because it makes it transparent. We can't read, as academics, we can't read what's in your head. Once you write it down, we can start to see it. Now, it's not the only form of assessment that we're going to be doing, but it's an important one. So the message then is writing and thinking are simultaneous and symbiotic. One doesn't precede or proceed from the other. In most cases, reading also gets intertwined with this process of writing and thinking. But of course, there are various kinds of writing and thinking that we can be doing. So let's start by thinking about how we might figure out what we're going to write. Well, I always think it's important to start with the audience, with the reader of your writing. So think about this audience. The audience could be many people. Who are they? What do you know about them? Why will they be reading this? How will they be reading this? What do they know already? What do they not know? And what impression are you trying to create? So if we start by focusing on that, and that might be a particular lecturer who's going to read your work, or it might be, if you're writing in a journal, for example, it might be whoever's the readership of that journal. So spend time thinking about this reader. Get a clear picture of them in your head. Stick a picture of what they look like on your computer, because ultimately, writing is a communication, and you need to be communicating to that person. The next thing you want to think about is the genre you're writing in. Now, there's lots of different genres we can write in. Now, if we were writing fiction, we might be deciding that we were going to write a science fiction novel, and then we might want to put an alien invasion in it and a robot and so on. Or if we were going to write a sort of high literature piece, we might have someone with rain and a rented cottage and all sorts of features that we would normally expect in that. Now, we're not going to be asking you to write any fiction in this, but we are going to ask you to think about the genres that you're going to be writing in. So there are quite a lot of different genres we're going to ask you to think about. So there might be a report or an essay. It might be what we call a reflective or a critical account, an improvement plan, an employer study, creating some kind of resource. There's lots of things that you're going to be asked to do through a course, and they're all different genres in which you're going to express yourself. So when you're thinking about the genre, here's some basic questions that you should ask. How long is a piece of writing in this genre? What kind of references do they use? What is the style? How are they writing? Is it long sentences, short sentences? Can you read something in this genre? Have you got an example? It's really helpful if you can read something. If I'm going to write for a magazine, I always will look at that magazine before I start writing to try and do it in a similar way to other people. Do they use I or we? What do you know and notice about this genre? And what isn't there? That's really important, as well as researching what is there. And regardless of genre, you want it to be clear, you want it to be brief, you want it to be purposeful, accurate and consistent. These are features of academic writing that we will really reward in the work that you do. And I think this idea of simplicity is really critical. I often use this quote from Einstein, where he says, the supreme goal of all theory is to make the irreducible basic elements as simple and as few as possible without having to surrender the adequate representation of a single datum of experience. In other words, write as simply as you can. Explain things as simply as you can. Good academic writing is clear and simple. So how about the process? Well, there's lots of different processes that you might go through. Here's some examples. You might find that you're spending too long on the writing, too long on the reading, taking too many notes, not planning enough, planning too much. It's useful to try and capture what your typical process is. But however you do it, there are some different styles. So one thing, you're always going to need to plan. So you might be a kind of writer who likes to plan, makes a lot of detailed notes, and then uses that to create a draft. Or you might be more generative. You might like to just get stuck in, start writing, perhaps using free writing or something like that. But then after that, you start to come back and you have to look at what you've written and figure out whether it's all in the right order. So all writers need to set deadlines for the completion of their key stages. They need to think about the task and brainstorm ideas. They need to make focused notes on the information that they gather. But if you're a planning writer, you probably start with your plan and then you write your draft from a detailed plan. If you're more generative, you write your first draft and then you create a plan from it and review the structure. So finally, let's think about what we're actually producing, the product. So what are you trying to produce? Well, you're not really trying to produce the world's greatest masterpiece ever. But what you do know is the harder you try, the more you will have learned. And so it is possible for us to see the kind of outcomes that we're expecting. There's a whole library full of academic writing that you can read, which gives you a sense of what a good piece of writing looks like. And there's a process of producing that, which is really about editing. And I would argue there's no such thing as a good draft. There's no such thing as a good writer. Really the key skill here is editing. So when we edit, I always edit my work 3 times. I read through first. I edit for argument. I do large-scale reorganizations. I think about the argument and the structure, and I try and address that. I then go through for clarity. I read each paragraph in detail, try and improve how it reads. I rewrite paragraphs and sentences. And then I finish up with accuracy. I look at small and important issues. I pay attention to detail. I proofread. I check things that I normally get wrong. So that's the process that I go through. So to finish up, my thoughts on writing are that writing is thinking. It's not something that's after thinking, it's part of your thinking, it's part of your process. You need to consider the reader, you need to think about the genre, You need to plan, write, and review, and then you need to spend time polishing the final product. And if you do that, you're going to produce some really great writing.